In the still hush of dawn, as the mist curled around timbered rooftops and cockerels stirred in distant barns, one solitary figure would already be awake. His boots, cracked and hardened by time, crunched across the cold, cobbled streets, and the air around him carried a heaviness few could bear. He was not a knight nor a priest, no merchant, no artisan, no bard. He was a gong farmer, and his was a life few dared to ponder, yet many owed their comfort to his toil. The term gong in medieval English referred not to sound, but to human waste. And so the gong farmer was a man of muck, a night-soiled digger whose hands knew the weight and warmth of what others discarded. In an age before flushing privies, before neat plumbing, before sanitation bore even its name, waste accumulated in pits beneath homes and communal latrines, dark and noxious reservoirs of the town's daily living. And when these cesspits brimmed over, when the stink grew too sharp for polite noses, and the flies turned bold in broad daylight, a gong farmer would be called. By ordinance, he would work at night, between the hours of 9 and 5 for such. A presence in daylight was deemed an affront to decency. With spade and bucket, with cart and coarse rag, he would lower himself into the bowels of the city, quite literally. Clambering down wooden ladders slick with mould and more, he would toil waist-deep or worse, scooping up the putrid slurry and hauling it away. The contents of entire neighbourhoods might fall upon his shoulders in one night. His skin, though scrubbed, would never fully shed the scent of his profession. Even the cleanest clothes could not mask the years steeped in filth. Yet this man, so reviled in public, so shunned in the square, was paid well, sometimes far better than the average labourer. Danger laced every breath he took. Methane fumes built up in these pits, threatening suffocation or sudden combustion. The risk of disease, unseen yet ever present, haunted his every shift. Historians suggest that gong farmers were particularly susceptible to ailments of the lungs and skin, though records are sparse, for theirs was not a life often recorded in loving detail. Still, within the sorrow and the stink lay a strange dignity. The gong farmer served the townspeople silently. He allowed the baker to knead dough unbothered, the children to play in cleaner streets, and the physician to walk unsoiled halls. And at times, he found odd treasures in the mire, lost rings, misplaced coins, even the occasional forgotten relic, dropped and never missed. Perhaps, in the quietest hours, as he watched the moon drift past chimney stacks and church spires, he felt a peculiar ownership over the sleeping town. Villagers whispered about him, of course. Children dared one another to watch him at work, giggling from shadows. Housewives pinched their noses and pulled shutters closed. But when their own pits filled and the flies returned, they sought him with urgency and coin. Such was the paradox of his place. Unwanted, yet indispensable. Loathed, yet needed. And where did he dispose of his nightly harvest? Often outside the city walls, in fields set aside for this grim offering. The waste, left to dry, might later serve as a crude fertilizer. Thus, in a strange turning of the wheel, returning to the earth that once birthed the grain. Some towns set regulations, requiring covered carts and specific routes to minimize the stench, but enforcement varied, and one can only imagine the paths he took through the darkness. Wheels creaking, night birds flitting past. Did the gong farmer marry? Some did. Often among the poorest, perhaps widows or others with few prospects. They, too, might work alongside him, a family trade of sorts passed from father to son. Children born of gong farmers often took up the trade themselves, for opportunities were scarce for those marked by such a lineage. Yet in some corners, the gong farmer found fraternity. Among others who laboured in the unseen sectors, gravediggers, tanners, executioners, he might find kinship. Men who dealt in death, in decay, in what society preferred to hide. Their gatherings, if they occurred, were private. A shared pint of ale in a darkened corner, a knowing nod, a silence filled with mutual understanding. One can imagine him returning home just as dawn broke anew, clothes heavy, hands chapped, eyes bloodshot. He might sit on a stool by the fire, steaming in his own scent as a child stirred in the next room, and the rooster crowed once more. His was not a restful sleep, for the odours lingered even in dreams, but it was sleep nonetheless, earned, paid for in sweat and silence. And so, the town carried on. Bells rang, markets bustled, priests chanted, children sang, and beneath it all, like the foundation stones hidden from view, the labour of the gong farmer remained, forgotten by noon, remembered only when the scent returned. In the tapestry of medieval life, with its knights and castles, its minstrels and feasts, let us not forget the hands that held the muck, the man beneath the moonlight, the keeper of the town's most intimate burdens. For without him, even the grandest hall would buckle beneath its own weight. Far beyond the village, where the woodland deepens and daylight sifts gently through tangled branches, a faint plume of smoke curls skyward. Not the lively smoke of a hearth, nor the dark pall of fire's ruin, but a steady, ghostly breath. This is the breath of the collier, the medieval charcoal burner, whose life played out in the hush of the forest and the fire's eternal hunger. Charcoal in the Middle Ages was not a luxury, but a necessity. It was the lifeblood of blacksmiths, the unseen partner in forging weapons, horseshoes, and tools alike. It was cleaner than raw wood, hotter in burn, and vital to the trades that built the world. But to make charcoal was to give oneself over to the flame. The collier was both artisan and sentinel, a man of fire and patience. His days and nights blurred, not in the rattle of swords, but in the whispering hiss of burning timber. He lived not in towns or manors, but in crude huts close to his earth kilns, simple mounds where fire and time turned hardwood into the precious black fuel. To begin, the collier would stack oak, beech, or ash into a dome, carefully arranged, tightly packed. Around it he'd coat layers of turf, soil, and moss to smother the flames, yet let the heat remain trapped. A chimney shaft allowed the smoke to rise, and small vents along the base gave breath to the embers within. Then, the fire was lit. Not in fury, but in patience. The burn had to be slow, almost lazy. Too fast, and the wood would turn to ash. Too little heat, and the wood would merely dry. And then, the waiting began. It could take a fortnight or more, depending on the weather, the wood, and the care taken. In that time, the collier could not sleep deeply. He dared not stray far. Day and night, he watched the smoke, learning its colour and shape like a sailor reads the sea. Pale and blue-grey. All was well, black and thick. A collapse within, danger of a full blaze. He would race with shovel and turf, sealing breaches, whispering to the mound as though it were alive. Few visited these forest men. Their presence was known, their work appreciated, but they lived in isolation. The very scent of a collier, smoky, sharp, elemental, lingered always. His skin was darkened, his hands calloused, his eyes wary from staring too long into flame and shadow. He cooked over fires that fed on their own kind, ate simply, and slept on straw in low-roofed huts where smoke coiled like sleeping cats. The work was treacherous. Earth kilns sometimes caved in, burying men or releasing a rush of fire and fume. The long exposure to smoke brought coughing fits and blackened lungs, and the constant solitude frayed the edges of the mind. Some said colliers spoke to the trees, others that they sang to their mounds as they worked, their voices lost to the canopy above. Yet these men were craftsmen. They understood the alchemy of heat and time. Each mound bore their mark, a certain shape, a way the wood leaned, a secret order beneath the soil. A good collier could supply a whole town's forge, his silent labour feeding the clang and ring of smiths many miles away. Children sometimes feared them, these shadowed men of the woods. Tales spread of colliers who wandered too deep and never returned, or of those who struck bargains with forest spirits for a steadier flame. Truth was simpler. The The collier walked with fire as a companion, and fire is a jealous friend. When the mound was finally done, the collier would dismantle it with care, shoveling away the earth, revealing the blackened wood beneath. The charcoal, light yet potent, was packed into sacks, often burlap or woven baskets, and hauled by mule or handcart to waiting buyers. The collier earned his coin then, enough to buy bread and ale, or perhaps a new shirt to replace one burned in the fire. Last collapse, but there was little rest. Once one mound cooled, another was begun. The cycle was endless, like the slow wheel of the moon. In spring and summer, when the roads were dry, demand surged. In winter, colliers might hunker down or sell off stored goods, waiting for the thaw. Though never honoured with statues or songs, the collier kept the fires of medieval life alive. Without his work, there would be no heated iron, no tempered blade, no glowing hearths in noble halls. His was a life spent in service to others' warmth, others' war, others' food. Yet he remained unseen, a wraith among trees, forever listening to the language of smoke. And when he passed, few mourned loudly. Perhaps a younger man took his place, or the forest reclaimed his hut, ivy slipping across the roof as though covering a wound. The smoke would vanish for a time, but then, one day, a new thread would rise again in the canopy, and the woodland would know the collier had returned. Along the outer edges of many medieval towns, where the wind might carry the foulness away from noble nostrils and market fare, there lay a district marked by its stench. It was not the scent of animals or rotting food alone, though both made appearances. No, this reek was sharper, heavier, a mingling of urine, dung, and decay. It was the unmistakable domain of the tanner. Leather was essential in the Middle Ages, for shoes, belts, armour, pouches, saddles, bookbindings, and countless other tools of both war and peace. But before it could adorn a noble or gird a knight, it passed through a process as grim and grueling as any battle. And at the heart of that process stood the tanner, elbow deep in hide and horror. The work began with raw animal skins, from cows, sheep, goats, sometimes even deer or dogs. These hides arrived with remnants of flesh, fat, and hair still clinging stubbornly. The tanner's first task was to soak them in vats of cold water, softening the remains. Then came the scraping, a brutal task done with curved knives over wooden beams. Day after day, the tanner would remove every last thread of tissue and strip the hair clean. But it was what came next that gave tanning its infamous reputation. To break down the fibres and prepare the hides for transformation, they were soaked in a mixture of pigeon droppings and human urine. Both were rich in ammonia, a natural agent that softened the leather and loosened stubborn remains. Tanners often collected chamber pots from townsfolk, even offering coin for their contents. This led to an odd economy, where urine, or chamber, lye, as it was sometimes known, became a commodity. The hides would soak for days in these rank pits. Tanners, with cloths over their mouths, or simply hardened by years of exposure, would stir the mixture with long poles. In smaller workshops, they might use gloved hands or even bare arms. The scent was overwhelming, not simply unpleasant, but invasive. It clung to skin and soul alike. No amount of scrubbing could fully cleanse a tanner's hands. Once softened, the hides underwent yet more treatment. They were rinsed, stretched, and then immersed in solutions of tannins, the source of the term tanning. These natural acids came from oak bark, chestnut, or sumac. Tanners would grind the bark into powder, mix it with water, and let the hide steep for weeks or months, depending on the desired toughness and colour. The process was as much art as labour. A skilled tanner knew just when to remove the hide, how to stretch it without tearing, how to oil it with fish fat or tallow for suppleness. But even the most careful hand could not escape the cost. The bark stained their skin, the foul vats stung their eyes, and the never-ending exposure to filth made them pariahs in polite society. Tanners were often required to live separately, outside the main boroughs. In some towns, their houses and workshops were grouped into districts near the riverbanks where waste could be washed downstream. The rivers themselves grew darker and fouler over time, a slow poisoning that fed into wider troubles, though few understood it then. Marriage prospects for a tanner's children were dim. The odour marked them, not just their fathers. Some tanners wore scarves or herbs beneath their collars when visiting the markets, though these efforts were mostly in vain. One could smell a tanner before one saw him, and yet they were needed. The paradox again rears its head. Just as the gong farmer was unwelcome yet essential, so too was the tanner. Without him, there were no boots for the soldier, no harness for the plough horse, no pages for the monk to ink his wisdom upon. Even the most delicate of books owed their smooth bindings to the labour done in the reek of a tannery. And despite the suffering, some tanners found a strange pride. Their craft endured. Their products outlived them. A well-tanned hide could serve a family for generations. The tools they shaped were held in countless hands, their mark carried across forests and fields. There were even guilds, small but tightly woven, where tanners shared techniques, bark recipes, and tips for managing the worst of the fumes. Some passed the trade from father to son, proud of the lineage despite its hardship. And in their quiet camaraderie, they found strength. In winter, the work was harsher still. The vats grew cold, their contents stiffer and crueler to touch. Hands cracked from the tannins and the frost alike. But the hides still came. The orders still arrived. Leather was always needed, always in demand. And so the tanner laboured on, his days filled with scraping, soaking, stretching, dyeing. His hands bore scars not of battle, but of steady, unyielding toil. His boots were heavy, his eyes weary. Yet when he looked upon a finished hide, smooth, rich, supple, he saw not just a product, but a transformation. From rot to resilience, from decay to durability. The townsfolk may have held their noses as he passed. They may have stepped aside in the street, but when winter came and their feet sought warmth, when soldiers rode out girded in strength, when merchants unrolled parchment to tally goods, they owed a silent debt to the tanner. His work was filthy, yes, but it was also foundational. And it carried the scent, not merely of waste, but of a world built on perseverance. There are nights in history where silence weighs heavier than the loudest clang of swords. And among those nights, few echo more mournfully than those that fell during the plague years. In the dark of those terrible times, when death came not, in armour, but in fever and boils, a quiet figure walked the edges of towns and hamlets. His job was not to heal, nor to comfort. He was the plague burier, and his was a service no one envied, but everyone required. When the pestilence struck, it came swiftly like a fog rising from unseen places. Whole streets emptied. Doors were marked with crude signs of warning, crosses or words hastily daubed in chalk. Families shuttered themselves indoors, praying that silence would protect them. And in that heavy silence, carts began to roll. Not the wooden joy of a market day load, but the hollow rattle of death's own chariot. The plague burier arrived where others dared not tread. Clad in layers of linen soaked with vinegar or camphor, makeshift protection against the invisible foe, he moved among the dying and the dead. In many towns, there were no priests enough to give last rites, no strong sons left to carry their mothers. There was only the burier and his cart, and the smell of decay carried on the wind. Corpses often lay uncollected for days. In poorer quarters, they might be wrapped in cloth, but more often they were left as they had fallen, in beds, on floors, sometimes in the streets. The burier would enter, sometimes called by a neighbour, sometimes by the telltale silence. He would lift the body, gently if he could, and lay it in the cart with others. The pile grew, each addition a sorrow too heavy for words. He worked quickly. The plague did not sleep, and every moment among the infected was a gamble with fate. Many buriers fell ill themselves within days. Few did this work for long. Some were pressed into it by force, prisoners, beggars, or those with nothing left to lose. Others volunteered, driven by pay or a sense of grim duty. Their pay was not always money, sometimes food, sometimes a warm place to sleep, and sometimes only the promise that their families would be spared. Towns that had the means might assign guards or watchers to escort the buriers and ensure the dead were truly taken. But often, the work was done in isolation. The dead were taken to common pits, mass graves dug hurriedly, often just outside the city walls. Some were covered in lime, which was believed to slow the spread of disease. Others were layered with earth in haste, as new bodies arrived before the last ones were fully buried. The air near these pits was thick, rank, and terrible. Birds circled, dogs barked and were driven off. No songs were sung, no eulogies spoken. And yet, in those moments, the plague burier did what few others could. He carried not just bodies, but the weight of a collapsing world. He moved among death to offer a strange kind of peace, the peace of rest, of stillness, of finality. Where fear reigned, he brought order. Where families fell silent, he gave the last service. Some plague buriers wore masks, crude, beak-like, contraptions stuffed with herbs or flowers. Most did not. They simply wrapped cloth around their faces, washed their hands in vinegar, and hoped. The beak mask, now iconic, was rare and mostly seen in the later outbreaks. In truth, most burying was done by men whose faces were never recorded, whose names vanished with the wind. Stories say that some buriers grew strange over time, that they spoke to the dead as they worked, that they carved small symbols into the grave walls, talismans of protection or pleas for forgiveness. Whether these stories are true, no one can say, but one can imagine the loneliness, the steady trudge through emptied streets, the sound of wind in ruined shutters, the echo of one's own breathing behind damp cloth. And what of the living? Did they thank the burier? Rarely. More often, they avoided his gaze, crossed themselves or muttered prayers as he passed. To see him was to be reminded of death. To smell him was to fear the future. He became a ghost in his own time, present, but not welcomed. Yet behind closed doors, some wept for him. Mothers whose sons he carried, wives who could not lift their husbands alone, priests who watched from towers, unable to descend. They wept not just for the dead, but for the man who bore them away. And when the plague passed, as it always did in time, the burier disappeared once more. Perhaps he died in the pits. Perhaps he removed his cloth, washed his hands, and melted back into the crowd, unseen. The towns were rebuilt, streets were scrubbed, life resumed. But in the quiet corners, in the shade of the churchyard trees, his work remained. Beneath the earth, his story lingered, not in parchment or poem, but in the hush that followed the storm. Let us not forget him, the one who walked alone when all others fled, who gave dignity where none remained. 4. In the tale of every town that survived, there is, buried deep, the step and shadow of a plague burier. In the quiet mornings when the mist curled low over the marshes and dragonflies skimmed the still surface of boggy pools, a lone figure moved with careful steps through the reeds. He carried no sword, no crossbow, no banner of rank, only a worn bucket and a sack of woven cloth. His was not a job of glory, but of strange necessity. He was the leech collector, a humble gatherer of the living tools of medieval medicine. Long before the germ theory of disease, when the body was thought to be ruled by humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, many illnesses were believed to come from an excess of one or more of these fluids. And chief among the treatments prescribed by physicians and barber surgeons was bloodletting, to release the excess, to balance the body. And for this, the leech was treasured. The leech collector knew where they hid, in cool waters, among the sedge and moss, in the muddy shallows of shaded pools. But they did not come easily. He had no fine nets, nor clever traps. The most effective bait was himself. He waded bare-legged into the water, standing still, letting his warmth and scent draw the leeches close. One by one, they latched on, their small mouths biting through skin, their bodies swelling with his blood. It was a quiet agony. Each bite stung, not sharply, but persistently, and the blood did not clot easily after removal. The anticoagulant in the leech's saliva kept it flowing long after they were plucked free. The collector's legs often ran red for hours, and many wrapped them in linen before returning home. Infection was a constant risk. So too was weakness, for the collector often bled more in a morning's work than was healthy in a week. But he persisted, for leeches fetched a fair price. Apothecaries, physicians, and monastic healers all sought them. They were stored in glass jars, carefully kept alive, and applied with solemn ceremony to patients suffering everything from headaches to fevers to swelling limbs. A few ounces of blood lost to the leech might, it was believed, restore health and harmony. The leech collector, however, knew nothing of harmony. His was a world of mire and sting, of cold water and trembling knees. His trade passed from father to son in some regions, or among those too poor to find other work. Women too took up the task, especially in the wetlands of England and France. They tied their skirts high, waded into the muck, and let the leeches find them. There was a kind of stillness to the work, hours spent unmoving, listening to birdsong and frog croaks, feeling the slow grip of nature's tiniest predators. But it was not peace, it was endurance. And over time, the body bore the marks, scars from bites, pallor from blood loss, tremors in the cold months when the leeches grew sluggish and harder to catch. In the villages, leech collectors were neither scorned nor celebrated. They were simply part of the strange machinery of health. Few asked them to supper, but few turned them away when they came to sell. Children watched them with wide eyes, especially when they brought jars of wriggling black coils, creatures that looked like something from nightmare, yet promised healing. Collectors learned to know their prey intimately. Not all leeches were equal. The best were those that fed eagerly and could be used more than once. Too small, and they were dismissed. Too large, and they might rupture. The ideal leech was fattened but not overfull, a strange balance that only experience could judge. Some collectors bred them in pools, especially later in the medieval period, but most still gathered them wild. In some places, the wetlands became scarred by overharvesting. Entire colonies of leeches vanished. The job grew harder. The collectors waded deeper. And yet they continued, season after season. By winter, the leeches vanished into the mud, and the collectors waited. Some turned to other labours, others mended nets or sold herbs. But always they watched the marshes, waiting for the first signs of spring, when the bloodsuckers would rise again from their cold sleep. There is little written of the leech collectors. No chronicles speak of them at length. No statues bear their likeness. But they were part of the quiet tide that supported medieval life. Just as the knight sharpened his blade and the merchant counted his coins, the collector bled for others, not in battle, but in the wetlands, with no one to cheer or mourn him. Some believed leech collectors grew strange in the head, that the constant blood loss made them dreamy or silent, that they spoke to the reeds or sang to the water, but perhaps they simply listened more than others, knew the rhythm of the marsh, understood that life and death often crept in on the smallest of feet, and when they passed, often from fever or from a wound that would not close, the marsh remained, still, green, whispering, as if to say, another will come, another will step into the shallows, another will give a little more of himself, so that others might be healed. In the heart of towns known for their cloth, those winding places where the loom sang and wool was wealth, there stood another workshop, far less romantic, often reeking, always loud. This was the domain of the fuller, and his task was neither gentle nor sweet. If the spinner was the song, and the weaver the rhythm, the fuller was the drumbeat of endurance, stomping behind closed walls with feet stained in lie and toil. Cloth did not come from the loom, ready for the world. Newly woven wool was loose, oily and greasy with lanolin, the natural wax from sheep's fleece. It lacked the compact softness of a cloak, the taut strength of a tunic. To transform it, to make it fit for market or for kings, it had to be cleaned and thickened. This was fulling, and so the fuller worked, most often barefoot, in stone. Tubs filled with water, soapwort, or more dreadfully, stale human urine, which acted as a powerful cleaning agent. Into these vats he placed great lengths of cloth, and then he began to stomp. Hour after hour, day after day, he walked and pounded the fabric with his feet, grinding it, working it, forcing the fibers to mesh and tighten. The motion was rhythmic, brutal in repetition. There was no glamour, no pause, just the sound of wet cloth slapping, the squelch of liquid, and the steady breath of men who laboured not for beauty, but for function. The ammonia in the urine helped, stripped the grease from the wool. Its fumes, however, stung the nose and eyes, made the lungs heavy, and coated the skin in a persistent sting. Fullers rarely escaped the scent of their work. Their feet grew swollen and cracked from constant exposure. Infection was a frequent companion. But the task could not be rushed. A poorly fulled cloth would tear or lose shape. The better the fulling, the warmer the garment, the longer it would last. Some fullers worked alone. Others laboured in teams, singing rhythmic chants to pace their stomping. In larger towns, fulling mills were built beside rivers, with water wheels powering great hammers called stocks that pounded the fabric. This spared the fuller's legs, but not his lungs, as the soaking and chemicals remained unchanged. And someone still had to tend the machinery, often slipping among wet stones and creaking beams. The work began early and ended late. Wet cloth was heavy, soaked with water and filth. It weighed several times its dry measure. Lifting, turning, folding. The fuller needed strength as much as patience. And yet, for all his efforts, he earned little acclaim. Merchants praised the weaver's design. Nobles admired the tailor's cut. But the fuller's name was rarely spoken. Still, he knew his worth. He could feel it beneath his heels, the way the wool shifted from raw to ready. He saw it in the evenness of the folds, the firmness of the weave, and sometimes, late at night, as he rinsed his aching feet in a basin of clean water, he might smile, not with pride, but with weary satisfaction. The fuller's workshop was often placed near the edge of town, where the runoff could be carried away and the smell bothered fewer folk. Rats and insects were common companions. The walls were damp, the floors always slick. Apprentices swept and scrubbed, though the scent lingered regardless. When summer heat rose, the fumes grew stronger, often unbearable. Some fullers wore cloth, masks soaked in vinegar to dull the sting. Others chewed herbs or held cloth to their mouths. None truly escaped the atmosphere. The work soaked into them as surely as it soaked the wool. Their hands grew coarse, their backs bent from lifting. Bolts. They aged before their time. Yet fulling was essential. Wool was England's treasure, Flanders' pride, the backbone of medieval trade across Europe. Without fulling, it would remain half-formed, unfit for sale. The king's robes and the paupers, cloak alike, depended upon the fuller's stomp and strain. Over time, fullers formed guilds in the growing towns. Their knowledge was passed down carefully. How long to soak, how hard to beat, which waters yielded the best finish. In some places, fulling became a family trade, with sons stepping into tubs where their fathers once laboured. Others left it behind, seeking lighter work if they could. But many found themselves drawn back by necessity. There were stories of fullers losing their feet to infection, of slipping beneath great hammers, of breathing in too much fume and collapsing beside their cloth. Yet the profession endured, because cloth endured, because the world must be clothed, and someone must do the work that made it so. As the day ended, the fuller would wring out the cloth, hang it across beams to dry, and rest his legs beside a dwindling fire. His clothes were stained, his skin rough, but his work, oh, his work, lay drying in the wind, soon to be cut and stitched, worn across hills and hearths alike. Few would thank him. Fewer still would know his name. But in every hem and hood, in every sleeve and saddlebag, the echo of his labour could be felt. A quiet beat, a steady stamp, the unseen rhythm of a fuller's footfall. At the far end of the square, beneath the watchful eye of the tower bell and the silent crowd gathered like winter fog, stood a figure cloaked not in steel or silk, but in the deep solitude of necessity. The executioner did not wear his name on his sleeve, nor did he boast of his trade in the tavern. He was a man apart, known by all, embraced by none. His task was final, unflinching, and forever shadowed. In a world where justice bore sharp edges and punishment was spectacle, the executioner held a role that none desired, but many watched. His was the hand that carried the sword, the axe, the rope that released souls from flesh under law's cold command. Yet behind the blade lay a man like any other, though few cared to see him as such. Beheading, hanging, burning, or breaking. Each sentence had its ritual, and each required a steady arm and a precise eye. There was no room for error. A clean. Death was mercy. A botched one drew jeers, stones, even riots. And so the executioner trained, with weighted axes, with practice dummies, sometimes in secret under the tutelage of an elder. Many executioners inherited the role, sons of men who once wore the same mask, or outcasts given a chance to serve society from its dark fringes. Some were former soldiers, hardened by war, others condemned men themselves, spared in exchange for a lifetime of killing. Whatever their path, their fate was fixed the moment they accepted the blade. Contrary to common tales, the executioner was not always hooded. In some regions, he stood barefaced, firm in his duty. In others, a cloth was worn, more for the crowd's comfort than his own. His attire was plain but practical, his tools sharp, inspected before each task. No rust could be permitted, no dullness. Precision was paramount, but the burden was not only in muscle or motion, it was in spirit. The executioner lived at the edge of town, by decree or by silent expectation. Few wished him as a neighbour. Children were warned to avoid his path. At markets, he stood alone. Yet everyone knew him, and when the hour came, they turned to him with unspoken demand. Do it clean. Do it swift. Do not tremble. He bore their judgment in silence. There were rules, strange and unspoken. He could not touch the church's chalice. Some would not take bread baked in his home. His coin was refused by certain stalls. And yet, if a thief was caught or a rebel sentenced, all eyes turned his way. He was the blade behind the judge's voice. Many towns gave him special privileges, tax exemptions, a portion of the criminal's goods, even land, not out of gratitude, but necessity. He could not work a trade like others. He could not be a blacksmith or baker, for who would buy from such hands? And so he lived within a strange bubble of fear and function. Execution days were ceremonies in themselves, the square filled with murmurs. Vendors set up booths, selling pies and mead. Children clambered for better views. Priests stood nearby, ready to offer final prayers. And when the hour came, the executioner stepped forward, tool in hand, gait. Steady, he did not smile, he did not speak. He checked the block, touched the blade, met the prisoner's eyes, if permitted, and then, in a single motion, swift, practiced, he did what no other could. The crowd gasped, some wept, others cheered, and he, blood-splattered and silent, withdrew. Afterward, he cleaned his tools in scalding water and ash. He prayed, not always to saints, but sometimes to old gods, or simply to the sky. He drank, perhaps, sat alone by the hearth, staring into the fire's depths, and waited for the next call. There were moments of reprieve, when no sentence had been passed for weeks. He walked the woods then, or fished along quiet streams. He watched birds with a strange gentleness, but always the summons came, and with it, the weight returned. Some believed executioners were cursed, that their souls bore the stains of every life taken. Others thought them blessed, chosen to carry sin so others did not have to. Most did not speak of it at all. They simply looked away. But he remembered every face. Not just the wicked, but the frightened, the wrongfully accused, the repentant. He remembered their last words, their trembling hands. He carried them in his sleep, in the twitch of a shoulder, in the curl of smoke rising from his chimney. And when he grew old, his hands stiff, his swing no longer sure, he passed the axe to another, a son, perhaps, or a desperate youth with no other path. He taught as he had been taught, how to hold the blade, how to breathe, how to forget. He faded, as all do, perhaps buried at the edge of the churchyard, perhaps not at all. His grave, if marked, bore no title, no honour. Yet the town remained, just, ordered, clean. And somewhere, in the silence before dawn, a door creaked open. A new pair of boots stepped into the square, and the cycle began again. High in the hills, where trees thinned and the soil grew chalky underfoot, a thin column of smoke could often be seen curling into the sky. It was not the smoke of a cook's hearth, nor the signal of war, but the long, pale breath of a lime kiln. And beside it, covered in dust, sweat and soot, worked the lime burner, a man whose days were steeped in stone and whose breath drew in the very air of danger. Lime burning was as old as roads and walls, and as vital as bread in a world of stone. Quicklime, the product of this harsh craft, was used to make mortar, plaster and whitewash. It sealed churches and castles, bound bricks into bridges, and painted the cottages of peasants and lords alike. But to create it meant coaxing, fire to impossible heat, and enduring the fury that came with it. The lime burner began with stone, usually chalk or limestone, dug from shallow quarries or pried from the hillside. These rocks were broken into manageable chunks, often by hand with hammer and chisel. Then they were stacked in great domes inside a kiln, a structure of stone or brick, sometimes built into the side of a slope to shield it from the wind. Between the layers of stone, the burner packed fuel, charcoal, wood or coal if available. When ready, he lit the fire, and the burn began. But unlike a simple blaze, this one had to be sustained at blistering temperatures, sometimes for days on end. The kiln roared like a beast. Flames licked the air. The stone within glowed orange, then white. The reaction was simple in science. The heat drove off carbon dioxide from the calcium carbonate in the stone, leaving behind calcium oxide, quicklime. But the process was anything but gentle. The burner had to stoke the fire constantly, feeding it like a dragon. He dared not stray far, not even to sleep properly. Many lime burners worked in shifts, taking turns to keep the fire alive. The danger was constant. Quicklime is not a passive thing. When it contacts water, even a drop, it reacts violently, generating intense heat and caustic steam. It can burn flesh in an instant, blind an eye with a single speck. The air around the kiln was filled with dust, choking, dry, and fine as flour. Many lime burners developed persistent coughs, wheezing through the years until their lungs could no longer bear it. Clothes were worn until threadbare. Hands blistered, then calloused. Burns were common, and few escaped without scars. Eyes grew red from the smoke, and faces took on a permanent mask of grime. But there was coin to be made. Builders paid well for good lime. Towns needed it by the cartload. And so the burner persisted, tending his kiln beneath the stars, drinking cool water with caution, for even sweat could cause the lime to hiss and sear. He learned to listen to the stone, the sound of cracking, the feel of the draft. A skilled burner knew when the lime was ready by colour and scent alone. Once cooled, the lime was raked from the kiln, white and brittle, and packed into sacks or barrels. Even this stage was risky. If the quicklime absorbed moisture, It might smoulder or burst. Transport was done carefully, with coverings to keep out the rain. The burner lived nearby, often in a small stone hut, the walls whitewashed with his own product. His world was small: kiln, quarry, shelter. His friends were few. His smell and stains marked him as other. Yet in his solitude, there was a kind of mastery. Few understood his craft, fewer dared attempt it. Villagers sometimes feared the kiln. At night, its glow painted the hills like hell's own hearth. Tales spread of lime kilns used to destroy bodies, true in some dark corners of history. But most burners were simple, men driven not by malice, but by fire and need. In winter, the work grew harder. Wood was damp and heat was slow to rise, yet mortar was still needed for repairs, for new hearths, for sealing the drafts of crumbling keeps. And so the burner's breath steamed beside the kiln, hands cracking from cold and heat alike. Children watched from afar, eyes wide at the flame. Few would follow his path if they had the choice. But in poor regions, there were no choices, only work, only fire. Some lime burners saved enough to buy land. Others faded with age, their lungs failing, their hands too weak to lift the shovel. The kilns cooled, weeds grew in the cracks, but the stone remained, waiting for the next man to wake it. And in every wall that held strong against rain, in every church that stood 100 years, in every cottage made bright with whitewash, there lay a silent testament to the lime burner, to the man who walked among fire and stone and gave the world the gift of binding, not with words, not with parchment, but with heat and dust and the quiet labour of a man who fed the flame. In the narrowest of alleys, where the sunlight barely reached and the cobblestones gleamed with a perpetual wetness, a small figure moved with quiet purpose. He bore no torch, no fine robe, no holy book, only a sack, a stick, and the trained alertness of a man who hunted creatures born from shadows. He was the rat catcher, and where filth festered, he was near. In medieval towns, rats were constant companions. They scurried beneath floorboards, nested in granaries, and darted through sewers and market stalls with bold familiarity. Where there was grain, warmth, and waste, there were rats. And where there were rats, there came fear of sickness, of spoiled food, of plague. Though the link between rats and the Black Death was not fully understood then, there was an unshakable dread surrounding them. People knew that with rats came fleas, and with fleas came death. The rat catcher, then, was not just a pest controller. He was a quiet warrior against an invisible threat. The tools of his trade were crude but effective. A long stick with a forked end, sometimes tipped with metal. Small cages baited with offal. Traps fashioned from spring-loaded bars or iron jaws. And sometimes, when boldness met desperation, his bare hands, gloved only in rough leather. But more than tools, the rat catcher relied on his senses. He listened for rustlings behind walls, felt the change in air where droppings marked trails, learned the patterns of movement in barns and kitchens. He knew where the rats birthed their litters, where they gnawed holes in grain sacks, where they slipped through cracks no wider than a child's finger. He worked alone, often at night when the rats were most active. His clothing was patched, his boots worn. His scent, a blend of dust, old blood, and vermin, followed him like a second shadow. Children pointed, women crossed themselves, men nodded quickly and looked away. Yet despite his isolation, he was sought out. When food stores began to dwindle, when scratching kept families awake, when a sickly scent hinted at the decay of a hidden nest, a knock was sent to his door, and he came, without fanfare, without complaint. The risks were many: rats bite, and bites fester. Their teeth carried rot, and infections could travel fast. Their fleas clung stubbornly, biting the catcher as readily as their host. Many in the trade wore amulets or herbs, hoping to ward off sickness. A few said prayers. Others drank daily doses of vinegar or garlic-infused wine. None were truly protected. There were those who kept ferrets or small terriers to aid in the hunt. The animals darting into holes, flushing out the quarry. But even they could be wounded or fall sick. It was dirty work, dangerous work, and most who did it were men with few other paths open to them. Some rat catchers were itinerant, moving from town to town, announcing themselves with a cry or a crude flute tune. Others were bound to a lord's estate, paid in coin or shelter to keep the cellars and stables clean. A few were given small titles, odd bits of authority, but never true respect. Children often feared them. The smell, the sacks filled with twitching shapes, the tales of men who talked to rats or kept them as familiars. And truthfully, there was a strange intimacy between the rat catcher and his prey. He studied them, knew their nature, saw not just their menace, but their cunning. Some even whispered to them as they laid traps or lifted dead bodies by the tail, offering muttered apologies or curses. Loneliness can do such things, especially to men who walk among filth, unrecognized and unthanked. And yet, the town rested easier because of him. Fewer squeaks in the dark, fewer spoiled stores, fewer reasons to fear the strange swellings that came without warning in the warmer months. He could not stop the plague, but he could thin the ranks of its harbingers. And so he endured, in shadow, in silence. In winter, the work slowed. The rats burrowed deeper into walls and basements, hiding from the frost. The catcher waited, sharpening his tools, checking his bait. In spring, the hunt resumed with fury. The thaw brought new litters, new danger. Sometimes he found nests, tangled masses of straw, fur, and flesh, pulsing with tiny bodies. He destroyed them with shaking hands. Not out of cruelty, but fatigue. The battle never ended. For every rat caught, another slipped through. At the end of the day, he returned, home, a shack on the edge of town, a room above a tannery, a space beneath an archway. He counted his kills, cleaned his blades, rubbed oil into cracked hands. He did not feast. He did not sing. He simply waited, and when he died, as all do, there was little mourning. His tools passed to another. His name faded. But for a while, the streets were quieter, the food safer, the children slept more soundly. And so, in the story of the medieval city, with its grand towers and ringing bells, let us not forget the one who walked beneath, whose ears were tuned not to praise, but to scurry, the rat catcher, alone in the fight against the dark that never sleeps. In the bustling maze of a medieval town, among blacksmiths' clangs and bakers' warmth, there was a place where barrels steamed and colours hung in the air like unspoken spells. The dyer's workshop, a corner of alchemy and labour, did not call attention with noise or scent, but with its curious stains, vivid and strange, that streaked the walls, floors and hands of those who laboured within. Colour in clothing was more than vanity in the Middle Ages. It signified rank, profession and wealth. Scarlet for nobles, green for merchants, blue for the faithful, and black, the deepest, most expensive black, for the truly affluent. But to dye cloth was to suffer. To extract beauty from the earth required a toll, and it was the dyer who paid it, day after day, elbow deep in chemical mystery. The work began with raw cloth, wool or linen, most often, pale and lifeless, from the weaver's loom. The dyer's task was to give it soul through colour, but the dyes did not come kindly. They came from crushed insects, fermented roots, soaked barks, and, most pungently, rotting urine. For colours to set properly, the cloth needed a mordant, a chemical fixative that opened the fibres, and the most common mordants were alum, iron, or ammonia. The latter was most easily sourced from old urine, collected from chamber pots and stored until it reached the necessary level of pungency. Dyers paid for it by the bucket, and the vats in their workshops bore the unmistakable sting of it. Once the cloth was prepared, it was lowered into dye baths. Heavy vats of steaming, swirling liquid, sometimes heated over fire, sometimes left, to ferment naturally. The dyer stirred the cloth with long sticks or lifted it with tongs. The work was wet, hot, and heavy. The cloth, soaked with fluid, grew dense. Lifting and turning, it was no light task. Some dyes came from foreign lands. Indigo from India, cochineal from the New World in later centuries, madder root for reds, and woad for deep blues. Woad, particularly common in Europe, was a troublesome plant. It had to be fermented into a thick paste, often in pits, where the dyer's bare feet mashed it slowly, mixing it with other ingredients in foul-smelling vats. The stench of a woad, dyery, was infamous. Towns often forced them to the outskirts, and yet the colour it produced, a soft, smoky blue, was prized across the continent. The cloth emerged greenish at first, then turned blue upon contact with the air, a quiet magic unfolding before the eyes. The dyer watched, hands stained, breathing the scent of weeks-old fermentation, marvelling at the transformation. Dyers bore the marks of their craft. Their skin, especially on hands and forearms, was permanently tinted. Reds left rust-coloured patches. Indigo turned skin a mottled grey-blue. Acids in the dye could crack the skin, burn the eyes, or leave sores that never fully healed. They were men and women of colour, not just in cloth, but in flesh. The profession required patience and instinct. A misstep in timing or temperature could ruin an entire batch. Some colours required days of soaking, others swift immersion. The dyer had to know the dye by feel, by scent, by the way it swirled. He could not rely on measurement alone. His craft was part science, part intuition. He worked in silence much of the time, stirring, lifting, wringing. Apprentices ran errands, fetched water, tended fires. Their eyes stung. Their backs ached. But if they endured, they too would learn the art of changing fabric, of turning drab to regal. Despite the hardship, dyers held a strange place in society. Their product was visible, admired. A noble's robe might owe its brilliance to a poor man's blistered hands. A bishop's robe, rich in violet, had passed through the fumes of a stinking vat. The dyer himself, though rarely invited to feast, was known by his stain, respected from a distance. In some towns, dyers formed guilds, their secrets passed from master to journeyman. Recipes for rare hues were guarded closely. The formula for a deep, lasting red might be held within a single family for generations. To steal it was to commit economic betrayal. But most dyers lived modestly. Their homes adjoined their workshops. Their clothes bore the marks of accidental spills, a patch of orange here, a splash of blue there. They washed daily, but the smell lingered. It clung to hair, to nails, to dreams, and as they aged, the labour grew heavier, the cloth harder to lift, the vats more difficult to stir. Knees ached, eyes dimmed. Still they worked, because colour was always in demand. Babies needed swaddling, brides needed veils, kings needed banners. In time, they were buried in plain robes. No colour marked their passing, but the garments they left behind, in chests, in portraits, in the folds of history, bore silent tribute. For in every thread of colour, there lived the toil of a dyer, and in every dye-slick floorboard, every stained finger, the world's palette had been born. Where the river narrowed and surged through wooden sluices, where the stones were worn smooth by the boots of men and the breath of water, there stood the mill, a structure of beams and gears, of thundering power and whispered dread. And within, it laboured the miller, a figure both necessary and feared, whose life was ground down by the same forces he harnessed. Flour fed the world. Bread was life for peasant and lord alike. But between the golden fields and the warm hearth stood the grinding stone, a massive pair of circular slabs, one stationary, the other turning ceaselessly, crushing grain to powder. To keep those stones moving, to ensure the stream flowed, the belts turned and the flour fell fine. That was the work of the miller. It began before dawn. The water wheel had to be checked, cleared of moss, ice, or debris. In some regions, the mill was wind-driven, and then the sails had to be unfurled, their angle adjusted to catch the breeze. But most often, the miller relied on the river, listening to its roar like a heartbeat, his fingers stained white with dust and grain. The miller worked in rhythm, not of music, but of machinery. Wooden cogs groaned as they turned. Leather belts snapped and whipped. The air inside the mill was filled with dust, a fine pale cloud that floated with every movement, every sweep of a broom, every sack opened or closed. It coated the lungs, dry and stubborn, and over years carved out the breath. Miller's cough, they called it, a rasp that came with age and stayed until death. The job was dangerous. The stones spun fast. A loose sleeve, a misstep near the gears, and a man could be pulled in before he had time to cry out. Stories abounded of millers losing fingers, arms, even lives. But the work could not stop. Grain arrived in cartloads, and the people waited for bread. And then there was the burden of judgment. Millers were often distrusted. They took a toll, a portion of each sack they milled, as payment. Some were honest, weighing carefully, marking each bag. Others, less so, tilting scales, hiding flour, wetting grain to add weight. Whether guilty or not, many faced whispers and suspicion. Folk tales painted millers as greedy, sly, or even in league with darker forces. The mill itself, with its groaning gears and ceaseless grinding, became a symbol of hidden industry, something that fed the town, yet remained apart. Children were warned not to wander near. Women whispered about the strange lights seen in the windows late at night. But the truth was simpler. The miller bore the burden of constancy. He did not sow or reap, but he carried the harvest in his arms, in his lungs, in his bones. The sacks were heavy, each weighing more than a man could easily bear. Hour after hour, they were lifted, poured, tied, and stacked. His back bent early, his hands grew calloused and cracked, yet the rhythm never stopped. In winter the river slowed, the wheel might freeze, and the stones grew still, but mouths still needed feeding. The miller worked then to thaw the wheel, hacking ice, redirecting flow, or repairing frozen parts. The cold crept into his fingers, and the dust became damp, clinging to every surface. By spring the grain flowed freely again, and with it, the people. Peasants brought their sacks by foot or ox cart. Bakers came in with larger orders. The miller measured and marked, spinning his scales, grinding without rest. He rarely sat, rarely left the mill. He lived above it, most often, or in a small house beside the stream. His world was the turning of gears, the fall of flour, the thump of the great stones. If he had children, they worked beside him, learning to fear and respect the power of the wheel. If he had a wife, she scrubbed his clothes, though the white never truly left them. Meals were taken in haste, a crust of bread, a wedge of cheese. Water was drunk from the river, or wine when the day allowed. His dreams were filled with grinding sounds, and even in sleep, he turned with the wheel. Despite the hardship, there was dignity. His labor sustained the village. Without flour, there was no bread. Without bread, no feast, no sacrament, no strength. And when famine came and grain grew scarce, it was the miller who saw it first. In the empty sacks, the lighter loads, the desperation in customers' eyes. Some millers kept records, small ledgers of what came and went, who paid and who pleaded. Others kept no books at all, relying on memory and instinct. But all of them knew the weight of grain, not just in stone, but in soul. They grew old quickly, if they lived long at all. The dust never left their lungs, their hands curled with time, their hearing dulled by the mill's endless churn. But the wheel kept turning, and as long as it did, the people ate. And when the miller died, his son might take the wheel, or the town would seek another, someone willing to breathe dust, to lift grain, to bear the turning without end. and the river would keep flowing, and the mill would sing its grinding song once more. So let us remember him, the man who stood beside the wheel, who fed the stones, who turned toil into sustenance. The miller, cloaked in flour, alone in the storm of dust, steady in the work that never stopped, in the quiet heart of a medieval village or the towering precinct of a great cathedral, when the bell tolled, all paused. Its voice marked the hours, summoned the faithful, warned of fire or siege, and celebrated the holy rites of birth and death. But the bell itself, that massive, sonorous marvel, was born not in peace, but in fire, and the man who brought it forth was the bell founder. Bell founding was a craft of exacting patience, immense physical labour, and terrible danger. To cast a bell was to court the raw forces of earth and flame, to bend molten metal into perfect resonance. The founder lived among heat and hazard, shaping sound from silence in ways few understood, and even fewer dared attempt. The process began not with fire, but with clay. A mould had to be made, a core that mirrored the bell's inner shape, coated in wax to form the thickness, and then encased again in a thick shell of clay and dung. The wax was carved in fine detail. Inscriptions, decorations, the name of a patron saint or a noble donor. Then, when the shell was dry and hardened, the mould was heated and the wax melted out, leaving a cavity into which the liquid bronze would be poured. This stage was delicate, drawn out over weeks or months. One error, one crack, and the entire bell would be ruined. But even this was not the most dangerous part. That came next, when the bronze was born. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, had to be heated to over 1,000 degrees Celsius. The founder and his apprentices stoked the furnaces day and night, feeding them with charcoal, keeping the temperature steady. The heat was overwhelming, a dry, choking blast that seared the skin and blurred the eyes. The metal glowed white-hot, spitting sparks and fumes, thick with toxic vapors. When the moment came, the founder gave the signal, and the crucible was tipped. Molten metal flowed like sunlit lava through prepared channels, pouring into the waiting mold. The noise was terrible. A hiss, a roar, a crackling chorus of fire meeting earth. One slip, and a man could be engulfed. Burns were common. Fatalities, not rare. The founder's clothing, though layered and soaked, offered little true protection. His face was streaked with soot, his arms often marked by old wounds. Then came the waiting. The bell cooled slowly. Days, sometimes weeks. The mould could not be rushed. It had to settle, to breathe. And when the time came, the shell was broken open with hammers and chisels, revealing the bell beneath. Dull at first, then polished to a rich gleam, kissed by fire, and hung with hope. But the founder's work did not end with the casting. The bell had to be tuned. This was done by removing thin layers from the interior, shaving the bronze with utmost care. Each strike, each shaving, adjusted the pitch. Too much, and the bell was ruined. Too little, and the tone would be flat. The founder tapped, listened, adjusted. His ear, trained through years of toil, was as important as his hand. In some towns, bells were cast in place, large ones too heavy to transport. The entire process happened beside the church that would house it. Villagers watched from afar, curious and nervous. A bell was a sacred object, and its birth a solemn event. Bell founders held a strange place in medieval society. They were craftsmen, yes, but also artists, alchemists, and in the eyes of some, nearly mystical. They spoke the language of resonance. They made sound from silence. Their tools were ancient, their knowledge inherited. They often travelled, for few towns could support more than one casting in a generation. Their arrival was marked by processions, and their departure by heavy carts laden with bells wrapped in straw. Some founders served monasteries or noble courts, others were independent, wandering from town to town, leaving behind voices of bronze that rang long after their own grew silent. The work ruined many, The smoke damaged lungs. The heat warped bones. Some grew deaf from years of hammering and tuning. Few lived to old age, but those who did were revered, not for wealth, which was rare, but for their legacy. A well-made bell could outlast a dozen kings. The bell founder's tools, wooden frames, compasses, clay molds, tuning forks, were kept with reverence. Apprentices learned not just the technique, but the patience, the silence before the strike, the stillness before the pour. And when the bell finally rose, hoisted high into its tower, the founder stood below, hands blackened, eyes lifted. The first toll was not his alone, but he knew its soul. He had shaped it. He had suffered for it. Then he moved on, to the next town, the next tower. The roads were long, the wagons heavy, but the work called him, not in voice, but in memory and, though his name might fade, though his face might be lost in time, his bells remained, hanging in twilight towers, calling the living, mourning the dead, singing through centuries the fire-born labour of a man who carved time from bronze. In the hills beyond the towns and the whispering woods, where the land rose up in chalk and granite cliffs, there was a place of echoing strikes and ghostly dust, a place where men with thick arms and stooped backs chipped, hacked and hauled in endless rhythm. This was the quarry, and the quarryman, its keeper, lived a life carved from stone. Stone was the skeleton of the medieval world. It formed castles, cathedrals, bridges, and boundary walls. It lined the roads of Rome, the cloisters of monasteries, and the altars of kings. But before it was laid with reverence, it was torn from the earth with hardship. The quarryman knew this toil like few others, and his body bore the story of each stone he freed. The work began in silence, just before dawn. The tools were simple: picks, chisels, mallets, and wedges of iron. There were no machines, no dynamite, only muscle, grit, and time. Quarrymen rose early, their breath steaming in the chill, and they walked into the bowl of the quarry where the morning sun took longest to reach. There, the noise began, steel on stone, again and again. Not with haste, but with a steady tempo. Finding the grain of the rock, the weak line. In limestone, it split with some ease. In granite, it was a war. Every block had to be loosened, shaped, and lifted. A team might take days to cut a single block, and more time still to haul it from the pit. Dust filled the air, fine, grey, and ever-present. It coated skin, hair, and throat. Quarrymen coughed through their meals, spat chalk from their mouths. They wore scarves, not for fashion, but to filter the breath of stone. Still, the dust crept in. Silicosis, the slow death of stone dust in the lungs, was not named then, but it lived in many chests. Hands blistered quickly, even through gloves. The mallets jarred the arms with every strike. Shards of stone flew, sometimes slicing skin, sometimes blinding. Helmets did not exist. A quarryman's scars were part of his face. The blocks, once freed, had to be moved. For this, sledges, winches, ropes, and sweat were employed. Horses helped when terrain allowed, but more often it was teams of men, grunting and pulling, inch by inch, along planks greased with fat or lye soap. Many backs gave out before their time. Knees buckled. Bones snapped beneath shifting loads. Quarrymen were often grouped in brotherhoods, not formal guilds, but bands of workers who shared tools, meals, and risks. They developed signs, codes, calls over the noise of hammering. They looked after each other when they could, though accidents were frequent and swift. In summer, the sun beat down into the pit, turning it into a kiln. In winter, the ground froze, and the stone grew stubborn. Rain turned paths to mud, made rocks slick. Ice fractured the walls, sometimes sending slabs crashing without warning. More than one quarryman died in silence, crushed beneath what he sought to master. The work was seasonal, to a degree, though larger projects demanded year-round labour. Cathedrals, particularly, consumed stone endlessly. Quarrymen supplied the masons, who shaped the blocks finer. The masons wore aprons, worked under roofs. The quarrymen did not. Their craft was earlier in the chain, dirtier, riskier, more forgotten. Yet they knew the stone. They felt its weight, read its lines. A good quarryman could tell by touch whether a block would split clean or crack. He could smell the moisture in the rock, hear the strain as wedges widened. Sometimes, amidst the rubble, they found fossils. Shells pressed into limestone, strange shapes like teeth or wings. These were wonders, or omens, depending on who looked. Most were tossed aside, the work too pressing to allow for dreams. The quarrymen's homes were simple, huts of wood or stone nearby if they could afford it. Meals were hearty but plain. Bread, cheese, onions, perhaps meat on lucky days. Ale was preferred to water, which was often fouled. Sleep came hard and fast, bodies too tired to dream. They rarely attended church in finery. The dust never fully washed away. Their nails were black, their boots heavy, but in their silence there was a kind of reverence, not for the stone alone, but for what it became. They knew that in some distant city, their blocks would rise as towers, that kings would pray beneath ceilings held aloft by their labor, that lovers would meet on steps they had carved, and so they endured. When a quarryman died, buried under stone or felled by the long breathless years, his fellows raised no monument. His tombstone might be a block he had once carried, simple and rough, but the true memorial stood elsewhere, in bridges that spanned rivers, in castles that outlived kingdoms, in cathedrals that reached for heaven. Let us remember them, the men who broke the bones of the earth, who turned cliffs into chapels, who walked through dust and danger so that others might walk in light. Far from the castle walls and bustling town markets, beyond the neat rows of grain and the well-tended sheep pastures, stretched the woodlands, dense, tangled, and alive with sound. It was in these margins, between the known and the wild, that one might find the swineherd. A solitary figure, cloaked in smoke and mud, walking slowly amid a host of rooting pigs. Swineherding was no noble task. It was seldom envied, often mocked. Yet for the medieval peasant economy, pigs were essential. Easy to feed, prolific, and when slaughtered, a source of meat, fat, bristle, and bone. But to raise them required more than a pen and a bucket. It required days of wandering, nights, of listening, and an understanding of the forest's secret language. Pigs in the Middle Ages were not the pink, placid creatures of later farms. They were rough, bristled, sharp-tusked animals, half wild and ill-tempered. They fed in the forest, foraging for acorns, roots, mushrooms, and whatever else they could dig from the loam. It was the swineherd's task to guide them, to keep them from straying too far, from being lost to wolves, or worse, stolen by desperate men. Armed with a staff and sometimes a sling or small blade, the swineherd moved slowly with his charges, watching, waiting, calling in low tones or sharp whistles. He knew the patterns of the oaks, the signs of rain in the leaf curl, the scent of boars in the wind. He lived half in silence, half in grunts and squeals. His life was marked by isolation. From sunrise to dusk, he followed the herd. Meals were simple: bread, perhaps dried meat, water or weak ale, eaten beneath the canopy while pigs snuffled nearby. Shelter was often a lean-to, built of branches and brush. Some swineherds went days without speaking to another soul, save the occasional passing woodsman or monk. At night, danger grew. Pigs clustered together to sleep, and the swineherd watched with sharp eyes. Foxes, wild dogs, even wolves tested the edges of the herd. And there were human threats as well. Thieves who might carry off a pig under cover of dark. A single animal was worth more than many could earn in weeks. Swineherds slept lightly, wrapped in rough wool, a fire smouldering nearby. In winter, frost crept into their bones. In summer, the bugs swarmed. Rain made the ground slick and the pigs restless. Still, he remained. Few thanked the swineherd. Pigs were noisy, dirty, and unwelcome near town. When driven in for slaughter, They were kept away from clean areas, their smell despised. Yet each household needed lard, sausages, salted pork. Each feast required meat, and behind every steaming platter lay the muddy footfalls of the swineherd. Children sometimes followed him at a distance, laughing or throwing stones. Women whispered when he passed. His smell was strong, of smoke, sweat, and swine. His clothes were stiff with mud. But there was something else too, a quiet sturdiness, born of solitude. He knew the woods better than most. The trees were his, markers. He could find water where none seemed present, predict storms with a glance. He saw the seasons turn from within the forest, not from behind glass. He knew which mushrooms would kill a man, which berries fed birds. Some swineherds carved whistles or flutes to pass the time, their tunes echoing through the trees. Others sang to their pigs, crude lullabies passed down from parent to child. A few spoke to them as companions, not out of madness, but out of the deep, strange bond that comes from long hours shared with beasts. The job passed often through families. A father taught his son how to read the herd, how to call the stragglers, how to build a pen from fallen limbs. Some swineherds never married, their time consumed by their charges. Others kept small homes at the forest's edge, returning only when the pigs were penned for winter. In the harvest months, swineherds were busiest. Pigs were fattened on fallen acorns, their bodies heavy with the promise of meat. The herds swelled, the days shortened, the time of slaughter approached, and then the swineherd led them one last time, down the forest paths, through the village outskirts, to the butcher's yard. He stood back then, watching as his companions of many months were taken. Some looked away. Some felt relief. Others mourned quietly, their grief unspoken, but real. When the work was done, the swineherd disappeared again into the woods. There were new piglets to mind, new paths to walk. The forest did not rest, and neither could he. He grew old with a bent back and a squint. His hands were rough, his voice hoarse, but his step was sure, and in the quiet places between town and tree, he moved with the confidence of one who belonged nowhere else. When he died, alone or among kin, few marked his passing. Perhaps a neighbour remembered him. Perhaps a piglet squealed at the scent of his absence, but in the hush of the forest, his footfalls lingered. And so, let us remember him. The man who walked with pigs and spoke to no one, who knew the rhythm of the wild, who fed the world from its muddy fringes. The swineherd, keeper of the oink and the oak, faithful in his solitude. In a dim workshop near the edge of a medieval town, behind thick walls designed not for warmth but to keep in the heat, a strange and luminous art unfolded. The furnace burned white hot, like a star tethered to the earth, and in its glow danced figures with rods of iron and breath like bellows. They were the glass blowers, craftsmen of beauty and burden, whose lungs and limbs were shaped by fire as much as the delicate wares they made. Glass was a luxury in the medieval world, not just for windows, though rare and prized, but for vessels, chalices, and ornaments. It shimmered in churches, flickered in candlelight, and whispered of wealth. But before it could gleam in sunlight or catch the eye of a noble, it had to be born in sweat and flame. The process began with sand, soda ash, and lime, mixed and heated until molten. The heat required for this transformation was staggering, maintained with constant fuel, wood in poorer regions, charcoal where quality allowed. The furnace, built of stone and clay, had to burn night and day, for once cooled, it cracked and became useless. The glassblower approached this inferno not in fear, but in ritual. His tools were few, long blowing pipes of iron or brass, shears for cutting, paddles for shaping, moulds of wood or clay. His body was clothed in thick layers, often scorched, his hands wrapped to guard against burns. Yet still, the fire kissed him, and the heat pressed into his bones. To work the glass, he dipped the end of his pipe into the molten pool, gathering a glowing drop like honey from a comb. Then he turned, stepped back, and began to blow. With practiced breath, he expanded the bubble, a glowing orb of possibility. It was turned, rolled, swung, coaxed into form. The glass was alive in those moments, pliable and graceful. A wrong move shattered it. A pause too long made it brittle. Speed and delicacy danced together in the workshop. The air was heavy, tinged with smoke and ash. The heat never abated. Even in winter, the glassblower sweated through his tunic. Bissau, summer, the workshop became a kiln. Apprentices fetched water, stoked the fire, swept up shards. Their skin was slick with soot, their eyes red from smoke. Burns were common, not dramatic flames, but the constant sting of radiant heat, the sear of hot glass grazing a finger, the pain of touching metal left too close to the furnace. Eyes grew weak from staring into brightness. Lungs strained under years of inhaling ash and chemical vapor. Yet the work continued. Each piece, once shaped, was placed in an annealing oven, a cooler chamber that slowly reduced the temperature, preventing cracks. This final stage was as crucial as the first. Without it, the glass would shatter on cooling, undoing hours of labor. Not all glass blowers made goblets or flasks. Some crafted stained glass windows, assembling colored panes into sacred images. These artisans worked with lead strips and careful plans, often in collaboration with churches or wealthy patrons. The colors were born from metal oxides, cobalt for blue, copper for green, gold for red. Mixing them required knowledge, precision, and luck. The trade was passed down carefully, often from father to son, or through strict apprenticeships that lasted years. Secrets of temperature, breath, and timing were guarded closely. A single formula for a vivid hue could feed a family for generations. Despite their artistry, glassblowers were not widely revered. They lived on the margins, their workshops shunned for their fire risk, their smell, and their noise. Towns often placed them near rivers or quarries, away from wooden homes and precious markets. Still, their work was coveted. A merchant might pay handsomely for a set of matching goblets. A noble lady might treasure a delicate vial for perfume. A church might commission a window that caught the morning light like a vision. And in each, the breath of the glassblower remained, trapped in curves and reflections. He knew this, even if no one thanked him. He saw his craft in the shine of a feast table, in the glow of a chapel, and when his hands shook with age, when his lungs wheezed and his sight dimmed, he knew that something of him remained in every vessel that had not broken. Few glassblowers grew rich. The material was fragile, the patrons fickle. A month's work might vanish with a dropped crate. Yet most endured, not for wealth, but for the strange joy of creation, of shaping beauty from heat and breath. When one died, his tools were passed on. His molds, cracked and scorched, still bore his touch. The furnace, perhaps, cooled for a day in mourning, then roared again, eager for more. So let us remember him, the man who breathed life into sand, who shaped light and color through flame, who bore the heat so that others might drink, worship, and wonder. The glassblower, artisan of fire, silent singer of the fragile world. On distant seas, where waves rose like beasts, and the wind carried cries from lands unseen, there moved long, narrow ships with sails like wings and oars like limbs. These were the galleys, swift, deadly, and driven not by the breeze, but by muscle. Deep within their hulls, away from sunlight and salt spray, sat the rowers. Their faces were turned toward the stern, their eyes toward nothing, and their hands gripped the oar like a prisoner's chain. For many, it was exactly that. Medieval galleys, used in trade, warfare, and piracy alike, relied on human power to cut through the sea. Unlike broad-sailed merchant ships, the galley was low, lean, and dependent on its rowers to maneuver in tight harbors or swift pursuit. These ships bore the banners of kings, the symbols of commerce, or the emblems of raiders. But beneath their pride beat the hearts of men in torment. Rowers came from many places, but a great number were not volunteers. Some were criminals, condemned to hard labour as punishment. Others were captives from battle, prisoners of piracy, or victims of desperate poverty who sold themselves for a berth and a crust of bread. In the navies of southern Europe, especially in the later medieval period, galley slavery became systematized, a sentence with no end but death. They were chained to their benches, usually in pairs. Iron cuffs bound their ankles, and the oar passed through their grasp like an iron beam of fate. The benches were hard and narrow, the space was cramped, the air was foul, a stew of sweat, sickness, and salt. Buckets served as latrines, rats were frequent companions. Disease spread with ease. When the galley was in motion, the world narrowed to the stroke. A drum beat the rhythm. Sometimes a boatswain shouted, pacing the centre aisle with a whip or rod. The rowers leaned forward, pulled back, again and again in perfect unison. The oar was long and heavy, requiring the strength of multiple men. Blisters bled, muscles tore, but the ship moved. Sometimes they rowed for hours, sometimes days. When battle loomed, the pace grew frantic. Faster, harder, a storm of motion as the galley surged forward. A sudden stop or turn could snap a back or dislocate a shoulder. And when the ship was boarded, rowers remained in place, vulnerable, forgotten, sometimes slaughtered as enemies or freed as prizes. Food was minimal. Hard biscuits, salted meat, water thick with algae. Sickness was frequent. Dysentery, scurvy, infections from old wounds. There were no physicians below deck, only the mercy of stronger rowers or the indifference of guards. Some ships carried spare chains to replace the dead. In port, conditions were little better. The rowers were kept below or brought ashore under guard. They were rarely paid, barely clothed, and often beaten. Yet some were not slaves. Some were freemen who chose the life, drawn by poverty or the promise of pay. These men stood apart, slightly better rations, sometimes allowed a knife or a belt. But once the galley moved, all rowed the same. In rare cases, a rower could earn freedom through service, a benefactor, or sheer survival. Others were brought back by family, if they could be found and could pay. Most, however, died where they sat, buried at sea, unmarked, unremembered, and yet, in this brutal world, bonds were formed. Rowers learned each other's rhythms, shared water and stories, watched over the weak and grieved the fallen. They sang when allowed, low, rhythmic chants to keep the pace, to pass the time. Some prayed, others cursed, all endured. The galley itself was a marvel of medieval design, light, fast, deadly. But it was also a coffin for many. The commanders stood above, watching the sails and stars. The soldiers stood ready on deck, crossbows in hand. The rowers, chained below, felt only the pull of the oar, the heat of the wood, the ache of breath. When storms came, they had no shelter. When battles came, they had no armor. And when peace came, they were not released, only used. Again, sent to the next voyage, the next conquest. Some galley rowers came from inland lands, never having seen the sea before. Others were seasoned, their bodies moulded by years of hardship. All shared the same fate once aboard. The oar, the chain, the rhythm that ruled their days. Their stories are scarce. They left no letters, no memoirs. Their names are lost. Their graves the ocean itself. But their labour built empires. Their sweat moved armies. Their pain lined the pockets of merchants and filled the pages of conquests. And when the ships were broken up, when the sails were lowered, and the decks fell silent, the memory of their toil drifted away like smoke over water. Yet, listen closely, in the harbours where old stones meet the tide. You might still hear it, the low beat of the drum, the creak of wood, the breath of men bound to motion, the echo of the rower, whose life passed between strokes, whose strength drove ships but bought no peace. Let us remember him then, the man below decks, faceless and forgotten, who pulled not just the oar, but the weight of a world that never looked back. In a cottage dimly lit by hearthlight, where steam curled from battered cauldrons and the scent of grain hung thick in the air, a woman stirred her brew with quiet precision. She was not a priest, nor a noble, nor even a tradesman in the formal sense. She was an alewife, a brewer of ale, keeper of hearth and hops, and behind every sip of warm drink in village or hall, her hand had surely passed. In the Middle Ages, before beer as we know it took shape, ale was the daily drink. Water was, often fouled, milk reserved for the very young, wine too costly for most. Ale, thick, warm, and lightly fermented, sustained the labouring class, and though men drank it with gusto, it was most often women who made it. Ale was brewed at home, in small batches. Every few days, another round was begun, a rhythm of mashing, boiling, fermenting, and pouring that defined the lives of countless medieval women. It was hot, heavy work. The grain had to be soaked and mashed into a thick gruel, heated over open flames. The mixture, the mash, then had to be strained, boiled again, and left to ferment in large, heavy tubs. All of this was done by hand, with no clocks, no thermometers, no standard recipes, only the knowledge passed from mother to daughter, the feel of the brew, the smell of readiness. The alewife worked amid smoke and soot. Her hearth was her laboratory. Her arms ached from lifting barrels. Her skin steamed from proximity to boiling wort. Burns were common. Soot clung to her clothes. The smell of malt soaked into her hair, her breath, her very home. And still she brewed. Often she bore other burdens, children clinging to her skirts, bread baking in the oven, a husband in the fields. She rose before dawn and rested long. After dusk, the rhythm of her work unbroken by season or feast. For ale was needed every day. It fed the workers, comforted the sick, marked the holidays. Selling ale was both a necessity and a risk. Many alewives brewed for their families and sold the surplus to neighbours. From a barrel at the door, a mug in hand, a few pennies in exchange. A broom or greenery hung outside the home was the ancient sign that fresh ale awaited within. But prices were watched, measures were inspected. Local officials, ale tasters, walked the village to ensure fairness. If an alewife was caught cheating the measure or weakening the brew, she could be fined, scolded, even placed in the pillory or the scold's bridle, a cruel iron gag. Yet mistakes were easy to make. Brewing was not precise, and spoilage ever threatened. A single bad batch might turn sour, and reputation was hard to rebuild. Jealousies flared. Some men resented women earning coin. Some neighbours spread rumours. The alewife's strength, her labour, her independence, all invited scrutiny. In some tales, she became a figure of ridicule or suspicion, sharp-tongued, coarse, even witch-like. But the truth was quieter, more enduring. She was tired. She was capable. She endured. Alewives brewed in the cities too, in alley kitchens and stone cellars. Some prospered, their names known on every street corner, their brews in demand. A few ran taverns or inns, but most were modest, anonymous makers of drink that disappeared as fast as it was poured. The ingredients were basic: barley, water, sometimes oats or herbs. Hops were not common early on, and without them, ale spoiled quickly. A fresh batch might last 2 or 3 days. Thus, the brewing never stopped, even during sickness, even in grief. Some women brewed in silence. Others sang, low, rhythmic songs to pass the time, to soothe the stirrings of the mash. The cauldron steamed, the flames crackled, and the song rose, soft and strong. A lullaby for the brew, for the house, for the self. Children learned by watching, how to stir, when to strain, how to taste the edge of sweetness in the wort. It was not written, it was remembered. The knowledge survived in the hands, and in time, it passed on. But the arrival of larger breweries, the formalization of guilds, and the rise of regulation began to squeeze the alewife out. Men, with capital and connections, built larger operations. Ale became beer. Hops were embraced. Taxes rose. Licenses were demanded. The work moved from hearth to hall, and with it, the women faded from view. But for centuries, the alewife was there, sweating in the steam, stirring the mash, lifting barrels with aching arms, pouring mugs with steady hands. She bore the drink that quenched the town, warmed the winter, blessed the feast. She did not ask for thanks. She asked for fair coin, a little peace, a clean cauldron. Her face was lined not by drink, but by firelight and fatigue. Her pride was quiet, her labour loud. So when next we speak of medieval taverns and the drinks that passed from lips to song, let us raise a cup to her, the alewife, brewer of strength and silence, whose fire never faltered and whose brew sustained a world. In the courtyards of half-built cathedrals, where scaffolding crisscrossed the sky and bells had not yet rung their first note, there echoed the sharp, patient chisel of the stonecutter. He worked not in the grand halls or at the altar, but beneath the rising walls, a craftsman of shadows and stone, whose labour shaped the very bones of faith. Stonecutters were not mere masons. Their work began earlier, with the raw block hauled from the quarry, a faceless hulk waiting to be born. They were sculptors of function, transforming rough slabs into precise forms. Arches, columns, cornices, capitals. They worked with chisels, mallets, files, and their own sense of symmetry, harmony, and load. Each cathedral, castle, or town gate bore their touch, yet their names were rarely carved. The glory went to patrons, architects, bishops. The stonecutter remained anonymous, his work immortal, his name forgotten. His day began with light and dust. Dust filled his world, fine, pale, and ever-present. It floated in shafts of sunlight, settled in his beard, clung to his lashes. It drifted into lungs, dry and persistent. He coughed often and sometimes bled. Silica dust, as it's now known, claimed many over time, but then it had no name. Only the breathless nights, the failing strength, the quiet suffocation of age. His hands were his pride and curse, calloused, cracked, with nails worn to stubs. His knuckles swelled, his wrists ached, but his grip never faltered, for the stone was unforgiving. A single mistake could ruin hours of work, or worse, cause structural failure. The pressure was constant, unspoken, heavy. He studied each block with care, tapping gently, listening to the sound, clear and solid, or hollow and flawed. The grain of the stone guided him. He struck along lines that only he saw, coaxing form from within, as a poet draws meaning from silence. Stonecutters learned by apprenticeship, often beginning in youth. They carried tools, swept floors, observed in silence. Slowly they were allowed to chisel, first the simplest forms, then more complex. Only the most skilled shaped ornament, the faces of saints, the folds of robes, the wings of angels that adorned cathedrals. These were the master cutters, silent composers of stone hymns. But even the simplest cuts demanded focus. Straight edges, clean lines, smooth joints, all made possible by endless repetition and watchful eyes. The work was slow, not because of hesitation, but because it could not be hurried. Stone obeyed only patience. The tools themselves required care. A dull chisel could slip, shatter the stone, or pierce the hand. The sound of the hammer rang across the yard, not like a blacksmith's clang, but a steady rhythm. Tap, tap, pause. Tap, tap, pause. A melody known only to those who worked with rock. He worked in heat and frost alike. The yard offered no protection from wind or rain. In summer, the sun baked the stone until it scalded. In winter, fingers froze around iron tools. Yet the projects did not pause. The bishop waited. The Lord expected. The vision of the architect climbed ever higher. Stonecutters wore aprons of leather or thick wool. Some tied cloths around their mouths against the dust. Most simply bore it. Their eyes grew weary before their limbs did. Some went blind from years of squinting at fine detail. Others lost fingers or crushed limbs beneath toppled blocks. Despite this, many took pride in their craft. They spoke of reading the stone, of finding truth within rock. They shared jokes, tools, bread. They etched their initials secretly inside pillars, signs for the future hidden beneath layers of plaster and paint. At night, they returned to modest homes, often clustered near the site. Their meals were simple: broth, bread, a jug of ale. Their sleep, heavy. But even in dreams, the hammer sang. Some stonecutters were itinerant, moving from project to project across kingdoms. They followed the call of grand cathedrals, vast fortresses, bridges that spanned great rivers. Their reputation travelled with them. A master cutter could find work anywhere, if his joints allowed him to swing the mallet still. There was fellowship among them. Not always formal guilds, but tight bonds of craft. They spoke a quiet language, of tools, of faults in the stone, of how the light would fall on a cornice at midwinter. They passed their knowledge not in books, but through watching, guiding, correcting. They were not rich. Their pay, while steady, did not reflect the endurance their craft demanded. But they walked past buildings that would stand for centuries and could whisper to a child, "I shaped that." When one died, his fellows raised a chisel in salute. Some etched a mark into a hidden stone, not a name, but a symbol, a memory. The cathedral rose still, and his hands remained within it. So let us remember him, the stonecutter, who carved the lines of the sacred into silent walls, who bled into his work and shaped a world that still stands, whose sweat mixed with dust, whose fingers traced the faces of angels, even as his own faded into time. When the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the shadows stretched like slow fingers across cobbled lanes, the town turned inward. Shutters were drawn, doors barred, fires banked low, silence crept into the corners. But one figure stepped out, as all others stepped in. A man wrapped in a cloak, bearing a staff or lantern, whose steps echoed softly against the stone. He was the night watchman, lone sentinel of a sleeping world. His was a task few envied. While others rested, he walked. While children dreamed and fires burned low, he paced the dark, eyes alert, ears tuned to the wind. There was no honour in it, only necessity. In towns plagued by thieves, fire and unrest, the night watchman was a frail wall between order and the unknown. The tools of his trade were simple: a lantern, sometimes a horn or bell, a long wooden staff tipped with iron. In larger towns, a short sword might hang at his side. Though he was no soldier, his job was not to fight, but to deter, by presence, by sound, by voice. Each evening, just before dusk, he reported to the town hall or gatehouse. His shift would last until sunrise. Through every hour of the night, he was expected to patrol the streets, check the locks of market stalls, watch for signs of fire, listen for cries of distress. In some towns, he called out the hour, a ritual both comforting and eerie. 10 o'clock, and all is well. It was a phrase meant to reassure. Yet behind it lay a world of unease. Fires were the greatest threat. In tightly packed towns of a timber and thatch, a single spark could ignite a catastrophe. The watchman smelled for smoke, looked for flickers in high windows. If fire was spotted, he raised the alarm, banging a bell or blowing his horn to summon bucket lines and prayers. Thieves were another danger. Though most towns had walls and gates locked by sundown, not all trouble came from without. Some lived inside, waiting for sleep to fall over the streets. The watchman watched for figures that moved too silently, shadows that lingered too long. He knew the haunts of the desperate, the roots of those who wished not to be seen. He also served as messenger and mourner. If a child was lost, it was he who searched. If someone cried out in the night, it was he who knocked at the door. If a traveller was found lying in the road. It was he who fetched help. In this way, he bore not just a stick and lantern, but the quiet burdens of the community, all while most slumbered unaware. His work was lonely. The streets were empty save for cats and dogs, the scuttle of rats, the howl of wind through shutters. In winter, the cold bit hard. His cloak grew stiff with frost, his breath curled like mist. In rain, he was soaked through. In summer, he sweated under layers, swatting at insects drawn by his lantern's glow. He walked miles each night, up alleys, down lanes, along walls, and markets. He memorized every door, every weak hinge, every creak. He knew where dogs barked and where they didn't, where the drunk slept and where they should not. And he knew fear, for not all threats were natural. Rumours of witches, ghosts, and demons were whispered in every town. The church bells marked more than time. They marked the border between light and dark, between God's order and what lay beyond. The watchmen walked that border. Some carried charms, crosses, herbs, small tokens from wise women. Others muttered prayers as they walked. All had seen things they could not explain. A figure vanishing around a corner, a sound without source, a child standing in the street where no door had opened. Yet still they walked. Pay was meagre, often a pittance from the town's coffers, or food and lodging in return for service. Many watchmen were aging labourers, men too worn for heavier work. Some were wounded soldiers, others former criminals seeking redemption or simply a place to belong. They were not always loved. Some townsfolk saw them as failures, men who could not rise higher. Children mocked their chance. Drunks jeered. But when danger stirred, their value became clear. The watchman's reports were handed in each morning. Sometimes only a note, or quiet, other times longer, a suspicious stranger seen by the stables, a cart left untended, a window broken. The town clerk would read these and decide what, if anything, must be done. There were nights of joy. Festival eves when the streets were lit with lanterns, when music drifted from open doors. On those nights, the watchman felt less alone. He watched over revelers, smiled at laughter, stood as guardian of celebration, and there were nights of horror. When plague returned, he was often the first to know, seeing the marks on doors, hearing the wails. He reported them, marked them, and moved on. No time to grieve, only the walking. When he grew old, he walked slower. His lantern shook a bit. His voice cracked when calling the hour. But still he came, night after night, shoes worn thin, staff polished by years of grip. When he passed, the town felt the silence more keenly than they knew. No call in the dark, no steady step on the stones. The hour still passed, but the voice did not say it. So let us remember him, the night watchman, quiet walker of forgotten streets, bearer of a town's restless sleep. His light was small, his steps slow, but his presence was everything in the hush before dawn. Down by the coastline, where the air carried the sting of brine and the gulls wheeled endlessly overhead, there simmered a labour few noticed, yet from which every household drew quiet benefit. Along tidal flats and muddy marshes, in sheds thick, with steam and smoke, the salt boiler worked. His labour was not one of grandeur, but of slow heat, of standing over cauldrons and coaxing purity from the sea. Salt, that quiet cornerstone of medieval life, preserved meat, cured fish, seasoned grain, and steadied the bones. It was more than flavour, it was survival, and in a world without refrigeration, it was as valued as gold. But to gather it from the sea meant labour so enduring, so punishing, that only the most desperate or weather-worn dared embrace it. The process began with seawater, either gathered in great shallow pans during high tide or drawn inland through man-made channels. In some regions, particularly in northern Europe, salt fields stretched out like mirror glass, shimmering beneath the sun. In colder, wetter climes, where evaporation was unreliable, the water had to be boiled. And so the salt boiler took up his vigil. Fires were lit beneath great iron pans, wide shallow basins perched upon stone furnaces. The seawater was ladled in, and the heat began. It took hours, sometimes days, of steady flame to coax away the water, leaving only the salt behind. A delicate crust at first, then heavy crystals scraped by hand. The heat was relentless. The sheds that housed these pans grew stifling. The steam clouded everything. The salt itself clung to the skin, dried on lashes and brows, stung the eyes, crept into every crack and fold. The men, stripped to their tunics or bare to the waist, glistened with sweat and brine. Their hands blistered. Their backs ached from constant lifting, stirring, scraping. The fire had to be tended constantly, wood chopped and hauled, ash cleared, flame maintained. It was a dual agony. Heat from below, steam from above. The floor was always slick. The air hung heavy. Breathing grew laboured. Over time, the salt ate at the lungs, the joints, the eyes. Many boilers coughed until they could no longer work. Few made it to old age. And yet, the work was precise. The boiling could not be rushed. Too hot, and the salt scorched. Too cold, and it would not crystallize. Some batches were ruined by weather, rain seeping in, or sudden chills disrupting the boil. Others failed because of impurities in the water. Each day brought risk. The finished salt was heaped into wooden tubs, sometimes dried further in heated rooms, then packed into barrels or sacks. It was coarse, strong, sharp to the tongue. It bore the mark of its maker, not in stamp or seal, but in the sweat that brought it forth. Salt boilers were often bound to coastal towns or estates. In some cases, the saltworks were owned by lords or monasteries who employed men seasonally. In others, independent boilers operated by license, paying tax or tribute for each sack produced. In places where salt was scarce inland, it was transported by cart, mule, or boat, its value rising with each mile. The workers were seldom well paid. The product was vital, yes, but the men were replaceable. Accidents were common. Burns from spilled water, collapses from heat, injuries from firewood or slipping tools. Medical help was minimal. Most relied on herbs, poultices, or simple endurance. Despite this, there was quiet pride. The boiler knew that his work lasted beyond the tide. His salt fed the army, preserved the merchant's catch, seasoned the winter's feast. And though no one praised him, he saw his labour in every smokehouse, every stew, every salted herring on a sailor's plate. Children avoided the salt sheds, the heat, the noise, the sharp smell. Wives worried over their husbands, watching them grow thin and red-eyed. But the work continued. The pans boiled, the water vanished, and the salt, like snow made of fire, remained. In some places, festivals marked the first salt of the season. A barrel opened, a feast held, a small token tossed to the sea in thanks. But these were rare. Most salt boilers ended their day in silence, skin raw, breath ragged, hands white with the stuff of life, their clothes stiffened with salt. Their tools rusted from the brine, their fingernails turned brittle, and still they worked. Not for glory, but because the fire did not wait, and the sea, like hunger, always returned. When one died, it was often sudden. A fall, a sickness, a fire gone wrong. He was buried in soil far from the tide. The salt, pans steamed on without him. Another man took up the ladle. Another back bent to the flame. So let us remember him. The salt boiler, steward of the sea's gift, who stood in steam and fire so that others might eat, might preserve, might live. His was a labour invisible in the feast, but carved into every bite. As dawn's first light touched the rooftops of medieval towns, chasing away the night's chill and smoke, one might glimpse a dark figure already at work. Small, often hunched, moving swiftly along ridgelines or crouching atop chimneys, he was the chimney sweep. A man, or sometimes a boy, whose labour sent him deep into the black veins of every hearth and hall. In a world warmed by fire and lit by flame, chimneys were lifelines, but they were also hazards. Soot built up quickly in narrow flues, narrowing the passage for smoke and risking fire. A clogged chimney could smother a household or send sparks raining upon a thatched roof. And so, the sweep came, unseen, unsung, and utterly essential. The tools of the trade were few: brushes made from sticks or wire, scrapers of iron, rope and weights. But more than tools, the sweep relied on his body, small, nimble, resilient. For much of medieval and early modern history, the job was often done by boys, thin enough to slip inside the chimney itself. They climbed from the hearth upward, using elbows, knees and bare feet, pressing against soot-coated walls, inching through dark, hot shafts. The air was thick, dry, foul. Every movement loosed a cloud of ash and grit. Eyes burned, lungs filled. Breathing became shallow. There was no space to turn around, no room to rest. Many emerged coughing, black from head to heel, streaked with sweat and soot. Others did not emerge at all. Chimney collapses, falls, or simple suffocation claimed lives quietly. When a child did not come down, a second was sometimes sent after him. There were no rescue plans, just rope and hope. In larger cities, chimney sweeping became more organised, but not always more humane. Poor families, desperate for coin, sold their children into apprenticeships. These boys, often called climbers, lived hard lives. Long hours, little food, no protection. They slept in sooty corners, wore the same stiff clothes day after day, and coughed through the night. In smaller towns and villages, the sweep was often a lone figure, a man too poor for other trades, too small for battle, too scarred for guild work. He climbed not because he wanted to, but because someone had to. His face was dark even when washed, his hands never clean. He worked in silence. Homeowners rarely greeted him kindly. He was a reminder of what they feared: fire, filth, disease. Yet they called for him each year, especially before the cold season, when fires would burn day and night. The climb itself was perilous. Chimneys varied in size and shape. Some bent midway, forcing contortion. Others were crumbling, their stones loose and sharp. A slip meant a fall into fire. A moment too long without air meant unconsciousness. Burns were common, especially when cleaning flues not fully cooled. And in wealthier homes, chimneys might connect to multiple hearths, a labyrinth of smoke and soot. The sweep knew each flue by touch. He could feel the build-up, judge the risk. He could tell how long since the last cleaning, and whether the chimney was safe for another season. Yet few listened to his voice. They paid him, then closed the door. Still, he endured. The pay was poor, the danger high, but the work was steady. In towns with hundreds of chimneys, the sweep could find labour year-round. In smaller places, he wandered, a sack over his shoulder, a rope around his waist, a brush in hand. He might sleep in barns or churchyards, beneath the stars or in abandoned cottages. Some towns banned the use of child sweeps after a string of tragedies. Others turned a blind eye. Laws were passed. Few enforced them. The soot-blackened boy became a symbol of hardship, of neglect, of necessity masked in grime. And yet, there was skill. The sweep had to read the flue like a book, understand airflow, pressure, draft. He could hear a blockage before he saw it. He knew how to tie his tools for maximum reach, how to move quickly if the smoke turned suddenly hot. In his own way, he was an engineer, unrecognized, uncelebrated, but essential. In winter, his work increased. Fires burned hotter, longer. Chimneys clogged faster. The risk of death from smoke or flame grew higher. He moved quickly from house to house, sometimes cleaning 10 or more in a single day. His hands cracked. His eyes watered constantly. His voice grew hoarse, and when the season ended, he disappeared until next year. No one invited him to feast. No one carved his name into stone. But they knew him. They needed him. And when the first cold wind blew, they would look to the chimney and wonder, is it clear? When he died, there was little ceremony. A grave, without inscription. A brush left leaning against a wall. Another would take his place. The chimneys still stood. The fire still burned. So let us remember him. The chimney sweep, blackened by labour, swallowed by flues, who climbed through soot and silence so that others might warm their hands in peace. His life was short, his breath often stolen, but his work lit the heart of every home. The sun rose slowly over the quiet edge of the village, casting long shadows over low stone walls and the leaning markers of the dead. Crows wheeled above in slow circles, and the ground, damp with morning dew, gave off the scent of turned earth. Here, among moss-covered tombs and wooden crosses, weathered to grey, moved a man few spoke to in life, the grave digger. He did not wear fine robes or chant over the bodies. That was the priest's task. He did not mourn beside the mourners. That was left to the living. His duty came before and after, in the hollowing of the earth, in the last touch of hands upon soil, in the silent witness to sorrow and decay. Grave digging was a profession of necessity, not honour. Every parish, from the smallest hamlet to the grandest cathedral precinct, required someone to prepare the resting places. In times of peace and health, it was slow, steady work, one grave a week, perhaps two. But in times of plague, war, or famine, the work turned to madness, and the shovel never paused. The digger's day began early, long before mourners gathered. His tools were simple: a spade, a pickaxe, sometimes a wheelbarrow. The ground was not always kind. In summer, it baked hard and brittle. In winter, it froze into stone. Some graveyards were old, their soil dense with roots and ancient bones. Others were muddy pits that sucked at the boots and stank of rot. Each grave had to be dug deep, 5 or 6 feet, wide enough to lower a coffin or a shrouded body with care. The digger worked with method, not haste. He could not afford collapse or error. More than once, an unsteady wall of soil caved in, trapping a careless apprentice or drowning the living in the grave of the dead. The work was lonely. It had to. The digger was not welcome in most homes. He carried the scent of the grave, a mixture of earth, sweat, and something more elusive, the whisper of endings. Children stared. Women crossed themselves. Men nodded grimly but kept their distance. He walked the village as a shadow among forms. Some believed he could speak with the dead. Others thought he could not be touched by illness, so long was his exposure. Superstitions clung to him like mist. Charms buried in graves, coins placed on tongues, secret signs scratched into the lids of coffins. He ignored them all. His task was practical. During the plague years, the work changed completely. There were no funerals then, only carts piled high, priests chanting from a distance, and orders to dig fast and deep. Mass graves replaced single plots. The digger worked in teams or alone, for days on end, hands blistered, eyes red from dust, and tears he did not have time to shed. He saw children buried without mothers, lovers lowered without a kiss, priests dropped in silence. There were not enough coffins, not enough cloth. The dead were wrapped in sheets or nothing at all. Sometimes he covered them with quicklime to hasten decay. Sometimes he simply covered them with earth and moved on. It haunted him, though he never said it. His dreams were filled with reaching hands, with voices calling from beneath. He awoke in cold sweats, his own name whispered by no one. Yet in peace the graveyard returned to stillness. He knew every stone by name, not the names carved into them, but their shape, their lean, the way they caught light at dusk. He remembered who lay where. He tended the earth when no one watched, pulling weeds, writing fallen crosses, brushing away the leaves of autumn. Some days he spoke aloud as he worked, not from madness, but from habit, a quiet greeting to the dead, a muttered apology as he dug too close to an old resting place. A song, perhaps, passed down from the man who taught him. The shovel sang its own rhythm. He earned little, a few coins from the church, the occasional gift of bread or ale, yet he asked for nothing more. His labour was a service few thanked but all required. Grave diggers often lived alone, in a cottage near the edge of the yard or within the church grounds. Their fires burned low. Their tables were sparse. But in solitude, they found a strange peace. For the digger, death was not fearsome. It was work. It was earth. It was silence. He saw that all came here, no matter their robes or titles. The knight beside the beggar, the nun beside the thief, the child beside the king. He grew old with slow limbs and a bent back. The shovel grew heavier. The graves took longer, but he continued. And when his time came, he asked for nothing elaborate. A simple pit, a prayer, and the earth upon his chest. Perhaps another digger placed him there. Perhaps no one wept aloud. But the ground remembered, and the shovel rested. So let us remember him, the grave digger who bore no blade but shaped tree. The end of every story, who stood between life and forgetting, shovel in hand, never blinking at the dark. He was not a knight, nor a scribe, nor a saint. Yet in his way, he was all of them, humble, enduring, final.